Hello and welcome. Today, we are going way back, over 2,000 years in fact, to get inside the mind of one of history's greatest thinkers, Plato. We're going to explore his absolutely radical vision for the perfect society. So, let's dive right in.
But let me start with the question for you. What if everything you see, everything you touch, your entire experience, what if it's all just a shadow of a deeper, truer reality? I know, it sounds a little like science fiction, but that very question is the key that unlocks Plato's entire political philosophy.
You see, to really get what Plato was trying to build, you first have to understand what he was trying to fix. And for him, this was personal. He lived through a truly traumatic event, the complete and utter defeat of his beloved hometown, Athens, by its arch-rival, Sparta.
Plato looked at the ruins of his city and came to a pretty shocking conclusion. He thought this wasn't just a military loss, it was a moral sickness, a political disease. And for him, the root cause was simple: ignorance. The city was being run by people who were obsessed with money and power, totally blind to what truly mattered.
And what's so powerful is how he connects the dots. He saw this direct, catastrophic chain reaction. It starts with the ignorance of the rulers. That leads inevitably to corruption. That corruption then splits society in two, what he called a city of the rich and a city of the poor. And once that happens, the whole thing becomes weak, divided, and just ready to collapse.
So this all boils down to one of Plato's most famous ideas. The state is the individual writ large. All he means by this is that a country is just a giant reflection of the people in it. If the people are greedy and selfish, you're going to get a greedy and selfish government. It's that simple.
Okay, so that raises a huge question, right? If the physical world, if Athens, is so broken and corrupt, where in the world do you find the blueprint for a perfect state? Well, this is where Plato gets really creative and introduces his most famous concept, the theory of ideas.
Plato basically argued that the world we see around us isn't the real deal. It's just a flickering, imperfect copy, kind of like a shadow, of a higher non-physical reality. And in that higher world, you find the perfect concepts of everything, the perfect circle, the perfect idea of beauty, and, most importantly for us, the perfect idea of justice and the perfect state.
And this is where his brilliant allegory of the cave comes in. Just imagine a bunch of prisoners chained up in a cave their whole lives, forced to stare at a wall. All they ever see are shadows of objects being carried behind them, and they think those shadows are reality. But if one prisoner was suddenly dragged out into the sunlight, well, at first, they'd be blinded, but eventually they would see the true world. For Plato, most of us are those prisoners, stuck mistaking shadows for truth. Only the philosopher has actually been outside and seen the sunlight of real knowledge.
All right, so now that we have that foundation, this idea of a perfect world of ideas, we can finally look at Plato's actual blueprint for the ideal state. And it doesn't start with laws or buildings. It starts with something much smaller: the human soul.
Plato said, look, every single one of us has a soul with three parts, and they're kind of always in a tug of war. You've got reason, the part that seeks truth. He called this the gold part. Then there's courage, which wants honor and glory, the silver part. And finally, you have appetite, which just wants basic stuff like food, drink, money, the copper part. We all have all three, but according to Plato, in each of us, one part is always in charge.
And this is where it all clicks together with his state, his individual writ large idea. He maps those three parts of the soul directly onto three classes of society. The people driven by reason, the men of gold, they're the natural rulers. Those driven by courage, the men of silver, they become the soldiers, the protectors. And those driven by appetite, the men of copper, they're the producers, the farmers, the craftspeople. Everyone has a place.
So this leads us to Plato's very specific definition of justice, and this is key. It's not about individual rights or equality in the way we think about it today. For Plato, justice is functional harmony. A just state is when every single person does the job they were naturally born to do and doesn't try to do anyone else's job. When that happens, you get a society that is perfectly balanced, excellent, and peaceful.
Okay, so if the state needs to be guided by pure reason, who on earth could possibly be qualified for a job like that? This leads us to Plato's most famous and definitely most controversial creation.
Plato's ideal ruler couldn't just win an election. They had to be forged over a lifetime. He designed this absolutely grueling 50-year-long educational marathon. It starts at birth with music and gymnastics, then military service, then 15 years of advanced philosophy. After that, they're forced back into the cave of the real world for another 15 years to get practical experience. Only if they survived all that at the age of 50 could they finally be considered worthy to rule.
And this ruler, this philosopher king, who is the living embodiment of wisdom, would have absolute power. Now why? Well, Plato famously said, "No law or ordinance can be mightier than knowledge." Think about it. You wouldn't tell an expert surgeon how to operate by making him read from a first aid manual. In the same way, you shouldn't tie the hands of an expert ruler with rigid laws.
But wait a minute. Absolute power? What about corruption? Plato was obsessed with this question. His main firewall was that the philosopher king is someone who loves truth more than power or money. But just in case, he added two incredibly radical safety nets for the entire ruling class. First, a communism of property. They can't own anything. And second, a communism of family. No private spouses, no private children. His thinking was, if you have nothing to be greedy for and no kids to favor, corruption becomes almost impossible.
So you look at this whole system. It's perfectly ordered, it's rational, it's harmonious. But the big question is, did Plato design a blueprint for a perfect utopia? Or did he accidentally design something much, much darker?
You've probably heard this saying from Lord Acton, and it perfectly captures the heart of the criticism against Plato. And that criticism started almost immediately with his own star student Aristotle.
Aristotle was a much more practical guy, and he basically told his teacher, "Hold on, these cures sound way worse than the disease." He argued that things like family and private property aren't evils we need to get rid of, they're ancient institutions that give people a stake in society. For Aristotle, a ruler needed to be worldly wise, not just an expert in some abstract world of perfect ideas.
But man, the most blistering attack came centuries later in the 20th century. After witnessing the horrors of totalitarianism, the philosopher Karl Popper looked back at Plato's Republic and made the absolutely shocking claim that Plato's ideal state wasn't just a little flawed, it was a blueprint for fascism.
So let's break that down, because it's a huge accusation. On one side, you have Plato's vision, ruled by an all-powerful, unaccountable expert. The good of the group, the whole, is everything. The individual is just a part of the machine. On the other side, you have what Popper championed, the open society. That's a system based on rule of law, where leaders are accountable, the individual and their freedom is the priority, and society improves through slow, careful reform, not radical revolution.
For Popper, this wasn't just a philosophical disagreement. By demanding absolute power, by justifying censorship and state propaganda, and by putting the state above the individual, Plato became, in Popper's eyes, the original philosophical enemy of freedom, liberty, and critical thought. And yet, and this is the really brilliant twist, even Popper, Plato's fiercest modern critic, had to admit just how massive his influence was. With this quote, Popper is basically saying that whether you love Plato's ideas or you spend your life fighting against them, you simply can't escape him. He set the terms for the entire debate about politics that we're still having 2,400 years later.
Which leaves us right back where we started, with this enormous question. Was Plato a brilliant visionary? A man who saw beyond the shadows and gave us a blueprint for perfection? Or was he the first great mind to draft the architecture of tyranny? The debate is as alive today as it was in ancient Athens. Thanks for joining me on this one.